Welcome, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started, and folks are still joining. We want to invite y'all to take a deep breath. However deep your body goes, and another. In these times, we have to remember to breathe and ground. Just please take a moment and breathe. I'm Kathy Aubert with Center for Transformation and Change, and here in the lands of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute. And so honored, delighted to be with my dear friend, the Reverend Doctor.
Hello, everyone. I am Jamie Washington. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am joining you today from the original homelands of the Piscataway tribe here in Baltimore County, Maryland. And so grateful that, folks want to spend this kind of time with us. And so we join you in breathing in this moment as we continue to navigate what I'm referring to these days as the perfect storm, right? The three major dynamics that have come together around the recession, the racial unrest, and COVID-19. So those three combining circles are positioning us in this current moment. So we come together recognizing that context and are breathing with you all wherever you show, whichever one of those circles has most of your energy, right? And that looks different depending upon where you are in the world and in your life at this moment and the intersections of those three. So welcome.
Welcome. And the intersections is why we're here. And I'm going to frame why I called Jamie and said, you want to do something? And then he'll talk about why yes. And then we'll talk about a bit about what we're hearing and learning from senior leaders and change agents in these times. And then we'll open to questions. So again, this will be an interactive webinar. And if you'd please just go ahead and put into the Q&A any questions, and then use the chat to share resources, talk with each other. There's so much wisdom in these 400 people here and growing. And so please support each other. So for me, when the pandemic hit, I started something called Community Connections, just a space a couple times a week for people to come and how are you? Breathe and just show up and be. And as we've done those for the last 12 weeks, maybe 14, I started hearing some really powerful patterns, particularly from BIPOC folk, Black, Indigenous, people of color, saying we're seeing the gaps in our resources, in our practices, our policies. Finally, some senior leaders were beginning to see that, particularly in how we serve people of color and Indigenous folk, there's just huge gaps in service and achievement. And they have some energy to listen. And they mobilized for the pandemic. But then all of a sudden, EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, racial justice, got pushed to the side in most of the organizations and people I talked to. And so while they had all this greater clarity, and then the people of color were being asked to do more, but only over here on the sides. And then I started hearing folks saying, now that 5 weeks ago, the murder of George Floyd, the assassination of George Floyd, and the cumulative impact of the murders of so many Black bodies and police brutality, folks were saying enough is enough. And as Jamie mentioned, the protests, the marches, and employees asking in organizations for more attention to anti-Blackness and structural racism, and this is the moment. And over and over and over, from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as white change agents, I'm hearing the leaders aren't listening. They're scared, and now they're saying, okay, equity inclusion people, what do we need to do? And you do it. You write the letter, you hold the forum. But that is no longer enough. Speaking up is no longer enough. BIPOC folk were exhausted before the pandemic, and now with whites mostly unskilled and not very willing or ready. And so I called the Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington.
So thank you, Kathy. And Kathy captured much of what happened in the moment for us and what we are what brought us together in this moment and what we were hearing. I would echo as similar in terms of the stuff that had us not engaging the anti-racist and anti-Blackness dynamics that were showing up in our organizations and have been for years. What we know at the Social Justice Training Institute, and what Kathy and I have been saying for a number of years, along with many of you, is that if we're going to do anti-oppression work in the context of the US, we must do our race work. We have a particular race history and colonization history, and we have to engage that work. And we have been talking about race for so long without having actually done or doing the depth of work that has been needing to be done within organizations. That is not to say there's not been amazing leaders, BIPOC folks, as well as white allies that have been in the struggle for many, many years. As we just did our in-core connection last year, that's a space where many of us have come together to kind of give each other strength and hold on. I appreciate that Jorge is asking in this traumatic moment how we maintain a sense of hope. And in-core white privilege are those spaces where the community has come together to maintain a sense of hope as we break down isolation and are not alone. But that being said, one of the major things that I want us to be able to engage in this space is how diversity, equity, and inclusion has been used, not necessarily consciously, but has been used as a way to disengage race. Mm-hmm. And that it's kind of the all lives matter dynamic. And while if you know anything about Kathy and myself and the work that we do, we are clearly committed to all lives, right? Without question, around the importance of that and intersectional ways that those dynamics play out. And what we are able to hold, and what I think the country and the world is calling us to hold right now, is how, in fact, what some have named as America's original sin of enslavement and colonization must be engaged at a real level at this moment. So that's the work we're in. That's what I hope we get to have some deeper conversation around how we manage. And I'll pause there. Kat?
So one of the first questions we thought we'd talk about was, as we're talking with senior leaders, what are we hearing, what are we learning, and what are we recommending? And so I don't know if you want to do all three or just start at the what are you hearing and learning, then I could share, or I'll just follow your lead. But I know your phone is ringing off the hook, your texts are happening so fast, like popcorn.
You are so right, Kat, they are happening at this moment as we are even in this. So the thing about, so if we were in a physical space, like if this crisis had happened in, if we had this racial unrest moment yet again, another moment where a murdering and assassination of unarmed Black people was occurring, and went viral, and we weren't in the pandemic having to be sheltered in place, then we might be in this kind of conversation or whatever in the physical presence of other folks, right? And I wouldn't see how much at every moment a text is coming in or an email is coming in. Because we are in the virtual space in front of our computers or devices, it's just constant. And very real at this moment in time. So what we're seeing right now is that, again, many of us who have been in the work for a minute and who have been helping organizations, institutions, and individuals see this is what means to live into the value of inclusion, and particularly through a race lens. We're seeing that folks are now in a space where they're like, well, we can't ignore this right now. I mean, it's just what we're seeing is, we cannot ignore that there's enough energy in the space that is calling us to do something. The other piece of that, though, is folks don't have a clue what to do. They don't know what they need to do. Do we create holding spaces for our BIPOC folk who are in pain? Are we taking the demands? Are we holding listening sessions for BIPOC folks so we can then decide what they need? And you're seeing everything from whatever they ask for, give it to them, to, let's talk about our diversity strategic plan. Let's do a cultural audit or assessment. We don't really know what's going on. Who is this really? So it's just all over the place. I had the opportunity to work with a group the other day, and I said, you all are a shit show, just a shit show, just every place. And you want us to come in and fix it. And so everything from the checklist, fix it now, give us what to do, kind of thing. So that's kind of what I'm seeing. People are all over the place. And the other part of it, what I'm seeing, Kathy, is folks who have been actively engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work are now feeling like people are going to finally listen, right? But some of the energy in that is really now you're going to listen, and there is this extra emotional and physical labor that's being put on those folks.
Yes.
To manage the organization at the same time they're handling themselves, and what it feels like to be in this space. So that's just kind of a quick snapshot. And so the one recommendation that I will name I'll hand off to you and we can keep going, is I'm recommending that folks just slow down. Slow down, and let's get into a real conversation about what makes sense for us to do in the next step, right? So lots of white people need to do something, and we do want you to do something, but we don't want you just so reactionary so that it can look like you're doing something and not really present to make anything happen.
Real transformative change.
That's right.
I don't know if y'all know Cheryl and Ifill, who's the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. As you're talking, I listened to Chris Hayes's podcast interviewing her last week. And she said, all these white people, and I'm relating to what you said, are calling saying, what do we do? What do we do? This sense of urgency. And it feels so familiar. Every time there's another racist incident on a campus, in a community, whites, especially white leaders, are like, let's do something with, I think, the unconscious or intentional purpose of just satisfy it for now. It'll go away. The media will stop. And Cheryl Ifill said, white folks are feeling this pain and pit in their stomach, and at a deeper, painful level than they might have before. And they want it to stop. And so they want to get into activities and let's do something. And she said, I've been feeling that pit in my stomach all my life. That's just part of the work. And so when I've been talking to leaders, I've been seeing very similar things: frenetic activity until the next crisis. And we haven't had the next crisis yet. But I'm asking leaders, let's pay attention to what you did when COVID-19 hit.
There it is.
How you mobilized, how you threw out the old ways and were a bit more, if not much more, open to new ideas, not worrying about hierarchy, best ideas from wherever we can get them, and action teams. So it wasn't just frenetic, but thoughtful, but fast movement. And so what I've been talking with folks is no longer can you just have a statement. No longer can you just say, let's get another task force. We don't know what to do. It's like, well, pull out all your surveys and get all your top leaders, not your equity inclusion only folk, but all your top leaders within a week to look at all your surveys from 20, 30 years and get the themes together. And then come with, what are you noticing are happening today in your organization? What are some policies and practices? So one leader, what I said was, I'd love you to say, we are eradicating racism in this organization. It's going to be a long haul, but we are committed to the long haul of eradicating racism and colonization in this organization. And to that end, I'm challenging all the leaders to lead. And when she did that, the leaders started paying attention in a new way, because she didn't farm it out to the senior diversity officer. And so some of the recommendations I'm making is how do we think about mobilizing leaders as well as everyone in their organizations to first have authentic dialogue, spaces, whether it's white accountability groups and affinity groups for Black, Indigenous, people of color, multiracial folk, and that might be separate racialized identities at some point, as well as come together to really talk about how you feel. And then for the white folks, lots of learning about racist policies, actions, biases they've seen. And so in-depth work, but really coming together to look at what are all our policies and practices? How do we train everyone to analyze with a race lens so that we identify the gaps? And are there some things we can do immediately? I know we both work in higher ed, and so the folks that are doing new student orientation, virtually in person, that are doing the student leader training, faculty development, anybody who's doing any hiring can get an action team of committed, competent folk who have felt pushed back and not listened to forever, have a lot of pent up energy, maybe not a lot of bandwidth given all that's happening, but a real action team that wants to analyze your recruitment and hiring practice to make some immediate changes that could make a difference. Setting expectations. What are the behaviors we want everyone to be doing? Recognizing racist microaggressions, interrupting them, analyzing practices and policies, changing the culture and the climate. You set those expectations, bring them into hiring, performance management, then folks will wake up and go, oh, wait a minute, I need to develop. I'll say one more thing and pass it. I join you that equity, inclusion, diversity training historically, not only have white people used it to talk about queer, trans, anything, gender issues, sexism, anything that we're more comfortable with than race. And so why we still focus on full breadth and keeping anti-Blackness and race, anti-racism in the center, as in dismantling anti-Blackness, also need to be thinking about how do we skill people up around issues of whiteness, white culture, white supremacy culture, and how to dismantle it. And all that I just said is probably scaring a lot of folks who are listening.
Right.
Because there's a huge competency gap that I am still growing and filling in. And if it weren't for you, Jamie, the Social Justice Training Institute, I would not be able to be here today having this conversation with you.
Well, Kathy, I just so appreciate, again, and all of the things that you kind of named is a part of the slowing down process, right? It is about getting deliberate and intentional around all of those things, right? And so how do we, who are we talking to? What do we need? What's the current state? And so that there is some assessment work. It is not doing another survey or having 10,000 more listening groups or focus groups. It's like it's pulling what we already know, right? We did this for the past 5 years, 10 years, and pulling what we already know, checking out the extent to which that truth is still there, that we got that information and did nothing with it in the past. All that stuff that you, and then how do we get strategic in terms of, so what can we do now, right? What's the actual, what are our actual touch points? New student orientation, first year experience for students, a hiring, what are our touch points? New faculty hires, talking about the tenure process, right? Looking at that, looking at what our performance evaluation process are. Where are the places that we know that we can do some process mapping and analyze how and where potential implicit bias can show up, right, in racist practices and behaviors. Again, Sam and I were engaging with an organization this morning, and as we began to share some of the very things that we're talking about right now, we just, after we named or like had a moment like this, we just stopped and said, let's just breathe, right? Because as we're talking about doing more than having training be the initiative, right? That is a whole different level of work. So folks are, one of the major dynamics in the context of organizations dealing with whatever the race crisis or diversity dynamic crisis is training is the initiative or a speaker, right? Training, a speaker, or commission, right? Yeah, get these three things in place, and then we have done it, right? All three of those things are valuable and important parts of the initiative and intervention, but any one of them by themselves leaves us wanting, right? And so we must begin to think about, so what's the capacity building, professional development, training stuff that needs to happen for our population, right? Who do we need? What's the leadership team, the council, the networks that need to be put together so that we can make sure that this work is advanced and moving forward, right? And then what's the assessment that need to be done so we can know that where we're going is in the right direction and how that we can have some success. So those three big buckets help to move us in a good direction with a clear understanding that all of that has to start with leadership, commitment, and buy-in around navigating and moving those efforts forward. So, and again, Kat, as you name, we are in a particular moment where we have folks listening differently, right? And the conversation has to be one that invites folks into, as you named, the COVID-19. We have to see why this matters, right? And be really clear that we can't move forward. We shouldn't be moving forward, given what our mission is, without addressing this dynamic of eradicating racism, right? And so just like, well, if we're going to proceed, we got to get online, right? We got to figure out how to do this virtually, and we got to figure out those platforms. And yes, we're incompetent. We don't know things, so we got to get people to help us to do that. It is the same truth, and we have to feel that same kind of truth around the dynamics of race, anti-Blackness, and addressing oppression. And there's a moment where folks are listening differently, and it's a good moment to try to get some traction to move the needle. It is true that this moment will pass. Absolutely. It is true that this moment will pass. And in terms of the energy for people to listen and hear. And why I know that is because I've been in many of these moments, right? And so whether it's just that local moment, because of what just happened on our campus or what just happened in our community, there's energy and folks are listening. And so that's very true. But there is potential when we have these moments to move the needle significantly so that we don't return to the place that we are, right? So we might not get all the way here. Kathy, you say a moonshot, right? You talk about reach for this, ask for it, get to that, right? And we might not fully meet that, but we won't return to the place that we are currently because we've just been able to move the needle just a little bit because this has been a moment for us to really listen. So for those who are listening and my change agents who really want us to get to the moon, let's shoot for it. High investment, low attachment. Don't give up and throw in the towel because they're not going to be ready to go all the way there. That institutional organizational change is going to take us all in it for many more moments, right? So that's where I am in this. What questions are we having? What's coming up?
So one of the questions, well, what do you do when leaders aren't calling other folks to help or don't have the current capacity? And so you have equity inclusion folk asking questions, Black, Indigenous, people of color, multiracial folks raising issues, some whites saying now is the time, and whites not moving into leadership. And I was talking to one person of color the other day who said, we need to get anti-racism into leadership definition. No longer accept any leader definition that doesn't include anti-racism. And that kind of blew my mind. And I've always had creating equitable, inclusive organizations, but to talk about anti-Blackness and anti-racism is a core competency that we hire for. And that language put into position descriptions, marketing, performance management, and if senior leaders will move in that direction and hold people accountable and start saying that, and then people move around it, it's a part of the moonshot. And so the question is, from Rachel Forrester, how do we get administration to take responsibility for holding themselves accountable instead of putting this on the folks that have always been raising these issues? Which I would add, I think is, tell me where I'm wrong in your opinion, Reverend Doctor, that I think it's dangerous. If it's only BIPOC folk raising issues in these times. And so if white change agents, white accomplices aren't raising issues in partnership, working together, then once again, when the rubber band goes back to not being stretched and we're not moving towards, then I think the retribution is going to happen, the punishment of those who spoke up, particularly folks of color. But leaders, how do we get leaders that aren't yet on board? How can folks within that organization manage up?
And I appreciate you naming kind of the managing leading up, right? And whose responsibility is it? How do we mobilize to kind of get that named? And so one of the things that I learned very early on in my career with a mentor of mine, Dr. Joan Lester and Dr. Carol Johnson from Equity Institute, was think well with and about your leadership. To think well with and about them. And so one of the ways that we get folks to move is to first pay attention to how we show up with them, right? If I am showing up with my leadership, making them wrong and uncaring people, that matters. We all know how we as leaders feel when we are doing our damnedest, right, to try to make the work, to move the needle, to balance the multiple demands and people and things that are pulling at us, and people are saying that we are doing nothing, right? So first, I say, how are you engaging leadership? Right. And so again, this is not about putting all of the onus on minoritized folks, right, to pay attention to how we're engaging. Part of the leadership challenge is to know that you have to be able to hold people in the content they bring, however they bring it, right? That's a leadership challenge. And that's a whole nother webinar that I can talk about. What's the challenge in charge of leadership right now? Even as you named, again, there should be no leadership definition without anti-Blackness and anti-racism in it as a competency, right? So there's a leadership challenge and dynamic. But what we do get to pay attention to is, how do you engage leadership? Are you engaging leadership the way you'd want to be engaged as a leader, right? Such that we are able to hold the complexities and the tensions of that role, right? And that maybe it's not my voice, but how am I paying attention to the assessment of the environment? And I realize, and we've seen this before. It's like, Dr. Lori Patton says, white people, get your people. Like she said that at the presidential symposium a little bit ago. So because it's not mine to do, they're not going to hear me in the same way. So some of it is, we have to figure out who has the leader's ear, right? And who has the leader's ear that we have. So we have their ear and they have leadership's ear, right? And so that we are working strategically. Again, this is real work. This is transformational, strategic, organizational change. This is not, let's just go and tell them and it's going to happen, because that's not how people work. It doesn't work in that way. We can shame and blame and demand and things into changing, and folks will do things for the news cycle if they have the capacity to do them, but that is not transformation. So you will get compliance, but not institutional and organizational transformation. So you have to decide what you're in it for, right? Now, sometimes, again, don't get me wrong, sometimes those demands and things that make people do something quickly, and if there's enough sustained energy around it that is not person-centered, so that when that person leaves, it's not just going to go back to business as usual, But if there's enough we're not going to have any new student orientation experience without having a session that embraces and engages race in it. And that's said, that's what's going to happen. That needs to happen. And you, as the person who's on the ground trying to make this happen, feel the pushback from leadership. If you're approaching them with that as a demand, if you would, that you might get okay, go ahead, do that. But that might be a waiting you out, right? That might be until you're gone. And so the opportunity to really, and so that might be we get 4 years of that. That might be enough to get enough buy-in from others so that when you're gone, it won't shift. Might be enough. So I'm not, again, so when I offer, Kathy, in this strategies and ways of being and how we address, it's not an absolute and only one right way. You've got to assess your environment. You've got to figure out who's the players in that and who gets to say this and who doesn't, and so on and so forth. So that's where, so for me, the first thing that came to my mind is, how am I engaging leadership? And do I even trust them? Do I even trust them? Do I respect them? And that doesn't mean I agree with them. I don't agree with all of their decisions, and I see they don't have capacity, and so on and so on. So I might have those things as problematic, but I still feel like I could work with this leader. I do respect this leader, and if that's not the case, that's a whole nother webinar, right? So, I say all the time to my parishioners, if I'm your pastor and you can't trust my leadership, then you probably don't need to stay in this space, right? Because unless I feel like I can work with this leadership to create change. Right? I don't like their behavior, but I do trust their heart.
So finding out where individual leaders are, as well as the culture and the climate of the organization. And there are many ways to do that.
I might have been frozen on some people too.
Am I live?
And I don't know whether you're talking.
I'm talking, so people can hear Kathy? Okay, so I'll keep talking.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
As y'all hear us, we're a great pair, because Jamie's like, slow down, strategic, assess, and I agree with all that with a little more of like, yes, and. So we may not be that far off. But as I've worked over the decades, and I know you have too, strategic planning groups often might take 10, 12 months and then put out a report. So I'm like, let the strategic planning group keep working, but let's form some action teams. And one of those might be a group that pulls together anyone that's been working with equity, inclusion, racial justice in your organization, including some HR folks, to meet with senior leaders to come together and talk about, so what is our why, as you mentioned? What's the business case, the leadership case? And have that conversation in community, facilitated. So who are the facilitators that can hold the space for all voices and help leaders hear why now and how is this different? And to be honest, I'd have them talk about their passion. I'd have them talk about how they are listening differently, so that some of the change agents can see the new evolving leaders. Because I do believe people, particularly some white leaders, are in a different place. The poll was 70% of US folks, so that's a lot of white folk, say that racism is critical, that we need to address now. I've never seen that stat so high. So something is different now. And then what are the areas that we can do some immediate action? And so while we're doing strategic change, so a group can be looking at longer term, what are some immediate, and I do believe, and I have been working with some senior leaders to identify, as I said, all the practices and policies and services, starting an intro website as well as open to all stakeholders. You've interacted with us. What do we do well around dismantling racism and creating racial justice? Where are we falling short around anti-Black racism and other forms of racism and colonization? And what recommendations do you have for us? And so just really mobilizing everyone to come in to some type of virtual Google Doc or something, and then make a commitment that there's a group that's looking at those while you're also doing long-term change. And so that same method could be, I'm working with the president and their cabinet. They're now working with their directs. What are all the practices and policies in our areas? How can we mobilize people, train them? And so that level of an accountability, coming back every week, what are we learning? How are we changing? Could move the needle faster while some of the more transformational conversations are happening. And I do believe if senior leaders are involved in some of these action teams and they're holding people accountable, they will hear more, see more, and they'll see what's possible. Most leaders I work with, and again, it's who calls me, it's like, we understand there's a need, we don't know what to do. And so I think getting them doing some of this analysis and revising, they can learn in the process, and we won't get it right, we'll make mistakes, but we'll get far farther. The other idea, how to get leaders going, is, as I mentioned, have maybe a small group. There's a group I'm working with, talked yesterday. They're going to pull together people and just pull together all of the themes and concepts from all the surveys from the last 10, 20 years. And just kind of high level, do not take 3 months, but do in a couple of weeks, and then come have conversations with leaders again, all the employee resource groups, affinity spaces, come together and have that conversation and ask what's current now and recommendations for change. A question came in, Jamie, about specifically anti-Blackness. What are some specific ideas to help leaders and the organization, while we're looking at all issues of racism, really be focusing on Black Lives Matters and anti-Blackness in this time?
So I want to do a couple things. And so I want you, Rachel Heiss is asking a question in there about do specific ideas for discussions of race in new student orientation. Plug July 13th, ACPA to go. That's exactly what we're doing. New student orientation with a race lens, how you include kind of that in a virtual learning space. So please check us out there. I'll respond more to that in a little bit. But I just want to join in your comment around all of those things to do, having leaders to do that, is we are on the same page, Kath. The energy that I'm inviting folks into is how are you asking folks to do that?
Yeah.
Right? And so do you hold that they don't know what to do, and then do you not demonize them for not knowing what to do? Right? The academy, the system wasn't set up for them to know what to do, right? And so yeah, we got some folks who might be out here who we experience as problematic, but it actually is not them at the individual level. It is a part of the systemic nature of who's been able to be in leadership, right? And so they're in there more than likely trying to do their very best. Most of the folks, I'm not saying not that we don't have a few outliers, but most of the folks who are in our institutions and in leadership aren't in there with an intentional, conscious energy to do harm across race and any other minoritized identity. Not all, I'm not saying that there hasn't been a few that slipped through, but so with that named, do I engage folks with the energy of, here, do these things, and since they don't know what to do, and they do them, and if they've done them without a clear understanding of the context, so it doesn't go well, right? Because they don't know how to engage when they're asking their people to do it, because they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to talk about it. They're doing the script. They haven't done their own work. Then when they fall short, are we able to hold, okay, here's how we recover. Here's how we get back on. Or do we blast them? Do we do we dehumanize? And I have seen enough of that
I've done it.
Yeah, right, to how we weaponize what we know as with righteous indignation as the right thing to do, without giving folks the tools and the skills and the space to do that, right? And that is not about taking care of white people. That's not about making white people or leaders unaccountable for their responsibilities, but it is about owning and holding the systemic ways this stuff stays in place. Oh, go ahead, please, because I was
Let
going
me
to go
jump
through
in
the.
before we go to
Yep,
anti-Blackness. But
yep,
we
yep.
done with that point?
Yeah, I am.
White accountability groups for senior leaders have had significant,
Yep.
relatively accelerated self-work and change
Yep.
to explore fears, their racist attitudes, white fragility, whatever you want to call it, and strategies. And so working with senior leaders, 8-12 hours, white accountability, it's kind of group coaching and intervention can be a great intervention for senior leaders. If it's a mixed race group of senior leaders, doing that in pairs of a person of color, particularly African American in this context, and a white person, as well as executive coaching for some of those senior leaders, the very leader, top leader, they deserve and need a space. Their competency gap is so high to avoid what Jamie is so rightly naming. Like, we'll give these leaders a chance for a moment, but you mess up one more time, we're done. They need much more investment. And if you're investing in leadership, I want you investing in all your BIPOC folk. Affinity space, series of retreats.
Exactly.
And not as in a deficit development model, but y'all been carrying this forever, and how do you thrive in this toxic organization? That's the frame. Yes. And whether it's Dr. Tanya Williams, Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington, we can name other folks, really focused on folks that have been experiencing racism and colonization. So invest both places. White accountability groups for other leaders, but let me stop there. Anti-Blackness, Jamie.
And you actually took us nicely there, because again, one of the ways that anti-Blackness shows up is that Black people can just handle it, right? And that there is not an investment in the labor, that whether we are formally in the work or just having to be every day as the work is happening. What's the expectation around how we show up, how we respond, what we say, what we hold, all of that stuff. Because if we don't do it the right way, we can be assured that there'll be problems. And that shows up across minoritized folks, right? And so the message around what is Blackness, right? So you've got to get to what is Blackness so you can get clear about what is anti-Blackness, right? So just like what is whiteness and so on and so forth, and how that has been systematically socialized in all of us to show up in it unconsciously. And so how do you get leadership to understand that or to embrace the importance of addressing that is a part of the capacity building work. So if we're going to do real work around race and colonization, then we have to engage what's the impact of 400 years of chattel enslavement, right? And how anti-Blackness got baked in throughout all of that. And it's not just about, okay, that ended on this day, right? As we just come off of Juneteenth. So now let's everybody just kind of get over it and go on and be nice to people, right? Or it ended in 1964 or whatever, right? Wherever we feel like, well, that was then. Whatever the marker is for you around, you all should be over it by now. Is not recognizing the residual impact and the ongoing systemic ways that got baked in continues to be baked, right, as we move forward. So that's a deep level of work, right? Just, not unlike the patriarchy and misogyny that's been with us, for forever. I'm not pretending like it's the only thing that got baked in that's problematic, right? But it's a thing that we've not engaged at a system or at a cultural level. Not that there aren't people who've been naming this forever, right? I'm not saying that, but we've not engaged it. And really not engaged it in the way that we are now. I mean, in this moment, the whole notion of BIPOC is new language, right? As we're talking about centering Blackness and Indigenous experience in people of color in that conversation, right? Pulling that out to look at more specifically how that has impacted all of us as people of color. in terms of this U.S. context and the way that blackness and whiteness and the binary and all of those things play out, and what that has meant and means. So again, as I talk about, so how do we get leadership? It's a part of that building capacity work that, as you talked about, white accountabilities, helping folks to see people don't know what they don't know. And so they don't know they're operating, and their mindset, their mind patterns are full of misinformation, full of miseducation. And so that's, and particularly in higher education, Kath, that's really hard because we feel like we know shit. We know stuff. We have degrees. And how can I not know this? And so I feel, so my ego gets in the way, and the expectations of me gets in the way, and so on and so forth. And so a willingness, again, I said this earlier in the conversation, if like Robin DiAngelo says in the book on fragility, or said in a video somewhere where I was listening to her brilliance, she says, what if white people really wanted to know? Right? Like they really wanted to know where the anti-blackness shows up and what it is and what it looks like, or what it means to be anti-racist, versus wanting to defend themselves as not being that. What if they really wanted to know how it lands, how it shows up, and how it manifests in the way? And I invite into that conversation, what if all people really wanted to know how this, because it's been baked into us as Black people as well, and we can show up problematic in complicity in this conversation as well, and all other BIPOC folks. So both are true, and that BIPOC folks have had some different kinds of experiences and opportunities to engage this, but for different reasons, even our own communities of minoritized folks by race and colonization have not engaged some of this work that needs to happen. So,
well, the system of white supremacy has impacted us all. Exactly. I just have privilege and advantage, and the system's baked for me. So there was a question about bringing change agents and EDI folks together. And I want to use that to continue what we're talking about. Could you imagine if anybody that's been involved in equity inclusion, and I mean, even if in their tiny unit of 12 people, they do pretty good work around race, whatever that is, nonprofit, corporate, government, you bring people together to learn about anti-Blackness with leaders, again, in community, and then see who's interested, who would be willing to start to look at how anti-Blackness is baked into different parts of our organization. So you find the willing, a little more to understanding, because I want to get honest, I know the term anti-Blackness probably has been out there until these last 5 weeks. Right. I haven't paid attention. And even the Social Justice Training Institute, I'm not
haven't used that language
much.
We haven't used that language in the same way. That's right. So 20 years in. Right.
I'm on a learning curve, but I am hearing APITA folk, Latinx folks and that was our first question. How are we within our communities of other marginalized, racialized groups perpetuating anti-Blackness as well? And so some of that healing work, and
absolutely.
Dr. Mamta Akapati did a fabulous blog about 3 weeks ago. The guy that does Patriot Act on something Netflix.
On Netflix,
I think his name, if somebody can pop it in the chat, that's great. I think it's Minaj, but there's a name I don't have. Wonderful, like a 17, 18, thank you, Minaj, calling in APITA folk. Just was wonderful. So there was work all around in group in marginalized identities. This means privileged marginalized. And I'm not sure white people, I think my people are having trouble even saying anti-racist or and just that we're still at I'm not racist. So there's just so much work to be done simultaneously. I'm saying to white people, we can do more than one thing at once. Right. You can be a white accountability group and do some action teams that are informing each other. You can, without, in partnership and following a leadership of people of color, indigenous folk, BIPOC folks. So I'm not saying go off on your own, but I think we can do things at once.
Well, I'm sorry. And so I wanted to back up for a moment because at SJTI, In the POC space, we have been doing anti-Blackness. We have been talking about that. We have been using that language. That in this last institute, the one before the one that COVID, that was actually centered in POC space other than Black, right? So Indigenous and POC. And so we came together as a full people of color group to begin to really engage that as a dynamic. And as you say that, it's only been about, so the dynamic has been present, but the naming of it has not been as clear, except for within the last 4 to 5 years. Yeah, so absolutely.
And I am behind the curve.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So I think I represent well-intended, even social justice, racial justice change agents. White people have so much to be learning and growing, learning with BIPOC folk. And so there's so many other webinars out there, books, and not just read a book and be done, but then how does that influence action, collaboration, coalition? Are there other ways you could see bringing change agents, EDI folks, and leaders together, what they could be doing in these times to deepen capacity and looking at structural anti-Black racism and other forms of racism?
Well, so I'm appreciating there's a lot of great stuff showing up in the chat. And so lots of resources for the work. So again, there's some great webinars that are out there. And if you just really just go right now and Google anti-Blackness, you can begin to see some stuff is popping up, some stuff that has been there that folks hadn't, but just gotten raised to the surface right now. But again, what you're inviting is a space that we all get to be in around kind of deepening and centering how this binary of Black and white and the anti-Blackness that's shown, the white supremacy and the anti-Blackness exist, right? So those are actually polar opposites of things, right? As we at one level as we engage this, and so lots of folks, it's like, well, what is white supremacy? What does that mean, right? How is that baked in, right? I don't know how. I'm beginning to understand white privilege, if you would, right? What I don't have to see or have to deal with, but what is white supremacy, right? And how is that baked in? Like anti-Blackness is baked in to the way we operate and engage, right? And so I venture to say for folks, anywhere you see white supremacy and whiteness is right, you will find anti-Blackness in the mix, right, of that conversation as we center anti-Blackness and look at the ways that we have got Black as wrong, evil, negative, not as much as you'll see white supremacy baked into that, right? Because they exist to keep each other alive and well, right?
So much, whatever that word is, synchronicity, and that's not the right word, but so the idea of expanding these ideas of book clubs. What if, for wherever you are, and whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in other sectors, you're not finding the support you want? So say, I'm going to be this week, I'm going to watch this webinar, I'm going to watch this TED Talk, and then I'm getting together at lunch or after our work, to do a virtual gathering. Who wants to watch it and just come together and talk? And while you're doing that, what are you learning? What didn't you know? So let people not have to be perfect, and you model, I didn't know this, I didn't realize this, I'm really wondering about this. And then the question, how might these dynamics be playing up in our organization? Do it with the willing. It's how years ago, even at ACPA, it's a student affairs organization, a handful of folk that at the time were lesbian and gay, we weren't even talking bisexual, early 80s, just started meeting, hiding, really, not public, but just coming together if it wasn't safe. So similarly, BIPOC folk together, maybe white folks come and do more learning, and then maybe at some point come together. Is there any other question? Here's what I think we'll do, is we'll collect up all the questions, and next week, in 2 weeks, July 15th, we will just start answering your questions, because all we've said is other things we will add to your questions. So please keep putting them in the Q&A. We might even, there are a few in the chat, but try to put in the Q&A. We do have some homework for you, I think.
Mm-hmm.
because these are going to be 3 different ones, all recorded, all coming back to you. But is there any other question, Jamie, that jumped out at you that you want to do in our last 5 minutes?
I am not seeing any other question that I feel like I want to have us jump in this last 5 minutes.
So how about I say homework, and then what if we do some hope? That was one of the first questions. Does that work, or you're still looking?
That is fine. I am looking for, see if I can, I just looking for this link that I have of work on anti-Blackness. That's a very powerful piece that's on YouTube that I wanted to copy and put in the chat. So that's what I
Perfect.
want
Let me do homework
as a good homework piece. Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody did ask for clarification around the first year webinar that ACPA is doing July 3rd. I don't know if you have that link or if somebody has that.
Okay, let's see if we can do that.
And a number of folks are asking about assessment and consultants. Why don't we do some thinking? Why don't you all as homework come ready to share? These are some folks that nationally are known to do some good culture change work. These are some folks actually regionally that do good work that just don't have a national name. And you can bring links and names and other resources for people to use on anti-Blackness and culture change. And here's your homework. Come with 5 examples of how anti-Blackness shows up in your organization and your community's structures. And then the webinar you just put in, is that you, Jamie? The anti-Blackness webinar?
Yep.
Fabulous.
And if you look at that webinar, it's about, if you look at an hour of it, you can do your homework without any problem. You look at the whole thing, it's about an hour and a half. Brilliant leaders and scholars who have been looking at this work for a long time. You look at that, that'll help to give you a solid foundation around what it is that we're talking about so that you can, kind of go and do the homework assignment around that. The orientation experience that we are actually doing a webinar on July 13th, and that is with WCG and the Washington Consulting Group and ACPA. I'm trying to see if I can locate the link to that as well.
And I'm reposting the link for the webinar. There it is. While Jamie's doing that, here's what I'd like everyone to do in the chat. How are you holding on, even if it's a glimmer, a whisper of hope? Because as change agents and leaders of transformation change, we have to be present in what's going on, holding all those emotions and still stay in it for the long haul. And hope is one of the ways we stay in. So for our last moment or two, how are you finding hope? I swear I just put the link in. It's a YouTube anti-Blackness. So.
It is in there. I'm not sure why some people aren't seeing it.
Okay. Thank you, Paulette. So some folks are saying, I work one-on-one with folks and I can see change at the micro level. Mm-hmm. And then someone just put in the ACPA to Go webinar. Thank you, Mariel. I went to all panels and attendees. So there's that. Sign up July 3rd. You're in White Accountability Healing Circles, working with youth. Final deep breath. Jamie, any final thoughts on holding on to hope?
Yeah. So I love that question, and being able to hold on to hope. It's actually during this, just for my church, it's Children's Month. We just finished Children's Month. And, this end of school year was unlike any other, for our all of our school age children as well as our college students, and what it meant. And so lots of parents has asked me how do I give my children hope in this moment, and how do I find hope? And one of the things that I'm saying to folks is that holding on to hope really is about an energy and an attitude. Right. So what am I hoping in? What do I believe in that gives me the capacity to not spin completely down in the circumstance as it is? right? So it really is about me being able to hold on to the work didn't start with me and it won't end with me. It's about recognizing the shoulders that I stand on and the privileges that I have to even be in the conversation at this moment. And I am present with the voices that that are calling to me that have not yet been born. So the voices that are expecting me to get it better, that have not yet been born. And so holding on to that truth, as that is who we are for those who went before us, right? And so recognizing that the biggest robber of hope is disappointment. And if I can navigate being able to hold disappointment as a dynamic, then I don't have to give up hope. Like, it might not all land the way I want it to in the time that I want it to land. So disappointment is going to happen, but I'm not going to give up hope. So that's how that's an energy. That's a way of being. That's a lifestyle. That's an attitude. That's not about the things that are happening. So.
Thank you for being in my life, Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington.
Yeah, I love you, Kathy. Over here.
I can't wait for our next couple. Anyone who registered, our intention is to send the recording once it's edited just a bit. People are asking for the questions. We may be able to figure out how to just put those in, because again, those are great questions to be asking in your organization with your people. So with that, we will be back July 15th, same time.
Yes.
We think it might be the same Zoom link. We're not sure. So you will get an email, anyone registered, if in fact, as we all are getting more competent technology.
Thank you all. See all the love that's coming into us, Kathy. And this is also a way that you hold on to hope, is that you're in community with people and you're creating space for appreciation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh.
Thank you. Really, really appreciating it. Really, really. We don't take any of this for granted. Thank you.
No.
Really.
Woohoo. Till next time.
Till next time.
Well, rest well.
All right. Thanks, Kathy. We'll talk later. Bye-bye.